We have a lot to talk about today, so let's cut right to the chase. I think what we're going to discuss in this video solves almost everything in the original story of FNaF, that being games 1 all the way to UCN, including FNaF World. So with that in mind, I would like to bring up a little theory you might have heard of in the past, known as Dream Theory. I think at this point most of us are familiar with Dream Theory, but for those who somehow aren't, it was a popular theory made by MatPat way back when FNaF 4 first came out. Nowadays, it's most certainly not the case. After all, we are like 11 games deep now, not counting all the spin-offs. However, there's this other famous little thing in FNAF's history called the One Retcon that Scott Cawthon himself spoke of years ago, back around the time of Sister Location. A lot of people think that Dream Theory was the original intention of the series, and that the fan backlash of Dream Theory, plus the backlash of FNaF World at the time, encouraged Scott Cawthon to continue the franchise. Now, to be fair, I think it's possible that FNaF 4 was supposed to be the final chapter once upon a time, and that the bad reception to FNaF World did lead Scott Cawthon to developing Sister Location, and so on and so forth. However, I don't think Dream Theory was ever retconned. As a matter of fact, I don't think Dream Theory was ever the case. I think Dream Theory is the byproduct of FNaF 4's vague storytelling, and the clues that we were given being quite reasonably misinterpreted. So today we are going to be talking about what I believe was the actual intention of FNaF 4 and how it shapes the story of the entire series. Today, we are talking about ShatterVictim. Now right off the bat, I want to preface that ShatterVictim, like many theories in FNaF, has different variations and interpretations. I was lucky enough that I had the help of some other FNaF fans in the FNaF Theories Discord server when it came to understanding the topic. Shout out to Wake and LT for their assistance in helping me understand ShatterVictim. ShatterVictim is also one of those theories that has actually existed for quite a while, though I've rarely heard it talked about by most theorists. I'm hoping with this video that more people get to learn about ShatterVictim, and that it even helps theory crafting going forward. With that all out of the way, I think the best place to start with ShatterVictim would be, of course, FNaF 4. In its simplest form, I think the story of FNaF 4 is a story about two brothers. The crying child that we follow throughout the minigames between each night, and his older brother, who is generally agreed upon to be Michael Afton. That would make the crying child William Afton's youngest son, and throughout these minigames, the crying child is consistently tormented by Michael. We see Michael jump out at the crying child while wearing a Foxy mask pretty often, causing the poor kid to keel over and sob. All the while, a Fredbear plush talks to the crying child, reassuring him and encouraging him to stay strong. The line, "tomorrow is another day," might ring a bell. Rather strangely, this Fredbear plush seems to follow the crying child wherever he goes. In almost every scene, the plush can be found somewhere, even in the weirdest of places. Behind someone's car, in a storm drain, or even in the sunflower. The only place we don't physically see the plush is when the crying child is at the actual Fredbear's location, yet the crying child can still hear him. Putting that aside for the moment, this all culminates in Michael and his friends accidentally killing the crying child on his birthday. They drag him to the show stage in Fredbear's family diner before forcefully putting his head into Fredbear's mouth, and you know the rest.
Was that the bite of 87?
But, very clearly, the crying child doesn't instantly die here. He's actually taken to a hospital where he resides in a coma until his eventual passing, and this is where Dream Theory would usually come into play. Dream Theory proposes that as this poor kid is dying, he's having these horrible nightmares based on his experiences, hence the gameplay of FNaF 4. But what Dream Theory also says is that the 3 games prior to this one are all part of the crying child's imagination. I won't get too deep into that because it's old news at this point, and it doesn't necessarily matter. However, I will say that a lot of evidence for Dream Theory is also used for ShatterVictim, and it really just boils down to interpreting evidence in different ways. In the final 8-bit cutscene we see in FNaF 4, we see the crying child in this dark abyss with a single light illuminating him. With him are his so-called friends, including the plush Fredbear that's been with him the entire game. We can tell by the gray text that appears that it isn't just the plush that talks here, but that the scene actually starts with Michael Afton talking to his younger brother. Can you hear me? I don't know if you can hear me. I'm sorry. Then the text becomes yellow again, and it's the plush speaking to us now. As Psychic Friend Fredbear talks, the other plushies slowly begin to fade away until only the Fredbear plush remains. But even he too disappears, leaving with those famous last words, "I will put you back together," followed by the sound of the crying child flatlining as his own life fades. But that's the story of the minigames. What about the actual gameplay? Hindsight is 2020, of course, and the actual gameplay of FNaF 4 is oddly detached from the story we just talked about, believe it or not. Originally, we all thought that we played as the Crying Child, considering we do play as him in the mini-games, though with recent revelations from the books and what we see in Sister Location, all our original notions have been totally flipped. For example, the bedroom that we defend ourselves in is actually most likely not the Crying Child's actual room, but is actually part of an experiment chamber connected to the Sister Location bunker, where William was carrying out fear experiments using Scarecrow-esque fear toxin. Does that mean the gameplay is actually real and not just some dream? Believe it or not, the gameplay of FNaF 4 is still a nightmare, it's just not the Crying Child's nightmare. It's Michael's. During the gameplay of FNaF 4, you can hear Phone Guy's first ever phone call from the first game. Along with that, in the Survivor logbook, Michael draws what looks to be Nightmare Fredbear. Or is it? In the trailer for FNaF 4, we see the tagline, "What have you brought home?" And in the Survivor logbook, we can find a rather interesting prompt that we're given to work off of. Quote, "I'd only been on the night shift for about a week, but I was so relieved to be switched over to the day shift. There's a lot of stress working 12 AM to 6 AM. My boss had told me that the animatronics were acting strangely, almost aggressive towards staff, but I wasn't about to let that scare me off. After work, I had an unsettling feeling that I was being followed home," end quote. So right off the bat, this is reminiscent of what Phone Guy tells us in FNaF 2 about the toy animatronics acting hostile and that Jeremy is to be moved to the day shift. Going back to FNaF 4 for a moment, I would like to once again credit Watch from the FNaF Theory's Discord server for this little fun fact. You'll be able to see his post on screen as I read from it. I'm going to be paraphrasing slightly. Watch states in this post that Nightmare Fredbear and Nightmare share the same AI in FNaF 4. You can even see this in the radar mode where Nightmare uses Nightmare Fredbear's icon. There's just a value that the game stores to know when to have Nightmare Fredbear swap to Nightmare, making them just reskins of each other with a few AI changes. He also goes on to say this value that tells the game when to swap them out, it's called Shadow, making Nightmare a shadow version of Nightmare Fredbear. Now that's pretty telling, but it doesn't end there. Again, thank you to Watch for this amazing information. He goes on to say that the shadow value has another use to help determine what night it is during the game. For example, if the value is set to 1, then the night is set to 7, and if it's set to 2, then the night becomes the 8th night. Nightmare will only activate if this value is above 0. That's interesting, but Watch goes on to propose a question. So what initially sets the shadow value for the game to determine the night, followed by the answer, the Nightmare mode and 2020 mode buttons, which are also called Shadow Freddy in the files. I mean, when it comes to vague confirmation in FNaF, it doesn't really get more clear than that. All this to say that the mysterious Nightmare is without a doubt Shadow Freddy. So to answer the question, what have you brought home, we have to look at the game files of FNaF 4 and that prompt from the Survivor logbook. It's important to keep in mind that the Survivor logbook was/is owned by Michael Afton, and it's one of the only pieces of FNaF media where we learned so much about the character. We also know that Shadow Freddy was present in the FNaF 1 location at some point, all of the FNaF 3 Follow Me minigames. So what's the point here? Point being that I believe after Mike was fired from the FNaF 1 location, Shadow Freddy follows Michael home and is possibly even the reason why Michael is having these vivid nightmares of William Afton's fear experiments. After all, his name is Nightmare in the game, so to me personally, that means he is the supernatural element coming into Mike's dreams and, again, possibly even causing them. It's a smaller point, and much less substantiated, but as mentioned before, Mike does draw Nightmare Fredbear in the logbook. But if you look at Nightmare Fredbear and Nightmare, you'll quickly realize that they look extremely similar. Quite literally, the only difference is their color palette. They even share the same AI in FNaF 4. We can even take it another step further and point out that if you look at Shadow Freddy in FNaF 2 and FNaF 3, his appearance is mighty similar to Golden Freddy from FNaF 2. For all intents and purposes, Shadow Freddy is like a mirrored version of Fredbear. So with that in mind, what if the illustration Mike draws in the logbook isn't actually Nightmare Fredbear, but Nightmare? Now why does that matter? it kind of doesn't, to be honest. We already established that Nightmare is Shadow Freddy via more concrete evidence, though that revelation is going to be our baseline going forward. You might be wondering how this all ties into ShatterVictim, and for the moment, we haven't necessarily gotten to the real juice of the theory yet. However, I thought it was important to differentiate/explain the gameplay of FNaF 4 before we move on to the next question. Now that we know that Nightmare is Shadow Freddy, what are the Shadow Animatronics? The Shadow Animatronics were originally introduced in FNaF 2 and made a subsequent appearance in FNaF 3. As we just discussed, Shadow Freddy is also technically in FNaF 4, but in FNaF 2, Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie are rare encounters, the latter of which crashes your game. However, in FNaF 3, they have a much more important role. Shadow Freddy is the entity that lures the classic animatronics to the safe room so that William Afton can dismantle them, while Shadow Bonnie, on the other hand, is a little bit more strange. He's one of the sprites you play as in the Happiest Day mini-games you need to complete in order to get the good ending of FNaF 3. But why? Why do either of them do this? Well, let me break it down for you. Some say that Shadow Freddy is almost akin to an ally for William Afton, hence why he helps lead the classic animatronics to their doom in the Follow Me minigames. On the opposite side of that, Shadow Bonnie seems to be a little bit nicer, so to speak. After all, he does bring some delicious cake to one of the ghostly souls seen in his respective minigame. There's also the elephant in the room known as FNaF AR, where if you collect too much Dark Remnant, which I'm willing to bet is just agony, Shadow Bonnie will appear and you have to fend him off. That would suggest that, seemingly, Shadow Bonnie is connected to Remnant, or rather, agony. We've seen this before in the books, actually. Creatures that seem to be manifestations of pain and suffering, whether it be specific persons or the literal trauma surrounding an event such as the missing child's incident. In the very first FF story, we explore the 1985 Freddy's location where the main character Oswald meets what seems to be a version of William Afton, or rather a monstrous version of Spring Bonnie. Into the Pit is a retelling of that horrific incident, a memory that Oswald is able to step into via the Ball Pit. The yellow rabbit we see throughout the Into the Pit isn't actually William Afton, but a byproduct created by the agony of the missing children's incident. With that in mind, I believe that Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie are byproducts of agony. Again, let me break it down for you. We should all be familiar with the MCI. It's that one event in the FNaF series that is consistently and constantly brought up time and time again. It's in the games, it's in the books, and it's in the movie. However, there's actually another incident that may or may not, most likely not, hold some significance to the story. That being the DCI, also known as the Dead Children incident from FNaF 2. For those who aren't aware or might have forgotten, William Afton does actually kill more kids after the MCI. After being moved to the day shift in FNaF 2, William puts on a yellow Springlock suit and game ends a few more kids, presumably the kids who go on to possess the toy animatronics. So we have two traumatic incidences where 5 children are killed by William Afton. But it's also worth noting that, although he is commonly connected to the Spring Bonnie costume in particular, the Spring Bonnie suit would still be in the back room of the 1985 location during the events of FNaF 2. In FNaF 3, Phone Guy says this.
Hello. This is just to inform all employees that due to budget restrictions, the previously mentioned safe rooms are being sealed at most locations, including this one. Work crews will be here most of the day today, constructing a false wall over the old door face. Nothing is being taken out beforehand, so if you left anything inside, then it's your own fault. Management also requests that this room not be mentioned to family, friends, or insurance representatives. Thanks again, and remember to smile. You are the face of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza.
It's very possible that the MCI incident is what caused the safe rooms to be closed, and with that, the Spring Bonnie suit would be left there for years. Which makes sense, considering the next time we know for certain it was used is in the FNaF 3 Follow Me minigames, where it was severely worn down. Obviously, we know what happened there. So when talking about the DCI, it's actually more likely that William used the Golden Freddy suit. That might sound weird, considering Spring Bonnie is so typically representative of William Afton, though it's not unwarranted. As a matter of fact, in the Silver Eyes novel, William Afton wears the Golden Freddy suit when kidnapping Michael Brooks, so we already have precedent for him using that costume. So for the MCI, William uses the bunny suit to aid him in killing 5 children, and then for the DCI, he uses the bear suit to help him kill 5 more kids. You might be able to see where I'm going with this. I believe that the Shadow Animatronics are the byproduct of the agony surrounding both of these events. I believe Shadow Bonnie was most likely created by the MCI and Shadow Freddy was created by the DCI. I think you could make an argument for a vice versa scenario where the origins of the shadows are switched. Very notably, Shadow Bonnie does appear in the form very similar to Toy Bonnie. However, it's also worth noting that the toy animatronics technically existed prior to FNaF 2 in the form of literal toys. And that brings me to my next point, or rather, it brings us back to the beginning of this discussion: ShatterVictim. In FNaF 4, as the crying child is being dragged to the show stage by Michael and his posse, we can see Fredbear and Spring Bonnie shadows being casted from the stage. Quite interestingly, these shadows are the same color as Shadow Bonnie from the FNaF 3 Happiest Day minigames. FNaF 4 is also the same game where we see those toy figurine versions of the toy animatronics, meaning that the toy animatronics were most likely based off these figures. If you're familiar with Dream Theory, you might recall Chica's beak being a detail of that theory. It was something that Sky even called out way back when. Dream Theory deposits that the reason Chica is missing her beak in FNaF 2 is because that's how the crying child remembers Toy Chica. In FNaF 4, when he sees the toys, the Chica figure is also missing its beak, hence the connection there. Right idea, but again, I don't think Dream Theory was ever the intention. I think the reason these Shadow Animatronics look the way they do, and by extension, why Toy Chica is missing her beak in FNaF 2, is because of the crying child. Earlier I mentioned something called agony, and I said that the Shadow Animatronics are byproducts of the agony surrounding the MCI and DCI. And I do think that's true, but what is agony in FNaF? It's not just a sensation, it's a powerful emotion that extends to the point of being supernatural. Hence characters like Pit Trap, Eleanor, and the Shadow Animatronics. In FNaF 4, the crying child is in immense agony. This poor guy is crying every 5 seconds and he's being tormented by his own brother. The characters that he calls his friends are being used against him to terrify him. William, he's certainly not winning any Father of the Year awards. He's not even around to watch his own kids. The crying child is having breakdowns constantly to the point he's pouring his heart out wherever he goes, because he is endlessly scared for his own life. With that in mind, I believe that many of the events and details of the Five Nights at Freddy's story are influenced by the crying child's agony. I believe that, after his death, the crying child's soul was shattered into pieces. But that begs the question, where did the pieces go? To answer that question, I think I should explain what the shadow part of ShatterVictim refers to. As I just mentioned, ShatterVictim refers to the crying child's soul being shattered, but more specifically, it refers to his pieces being split between the 5 core animatronics, that being Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, and of course, Golden Freddy. More specifically, it's not the animatronics themselves, but the souls of William Afton's victims that inhabit them. There's also variations to this idea, of course, that include the puppet. We'll put that aside for now and talk about it later. I also want to point out that there's another theory by the name of Memory Victim, which is very similar to ShatterVictim in a lot of ways, and much like Dream Theory, shows evidence and points with ShatterVictim. However, again, it just boils down to interpreting evidence in a different fashion. Instead of the crying child's pieces being split across the aforementioned 5 characters, it's his quote-unquote memory that is split across the entire timeline of the series, almost kind of like a curse, so to speak. Which, actually, that might have more merit than I think. But alas, that'll have to do for this video. There's still a lot we have to go over, and I think it's best if we split this up into at least a few parts. Today we discussed what I think FNaF 4 is and what the Shadow Animatronics are. 2 things that I think are already pretty big topics to begin with. We only briefly touched on the idea that ShatterVictim proposes, but in part 2 I promised that we'll be going deeper into that idea. Until then, I hope you enjoyed. Feel free to leave your thoughts below if you have any. This is one of those theories that I'm really interested in seeing what people think, and I hope I'm doing it some justice. Once again, thank you for watching, and I can't wait to see you again. Peace out.